Husband secretly recorded me to prove I was crazy. I turned his plan against him. Last Friday, I sat in our bedroom, rummaging through his nightstand by the bed looking for his phone charger. He always loses his stuff, and I always find it. The water in the shower was running, he was washing himself, and I was going through his junk. Keys, change, some old business cards. And then a tape recorder fell out from underneath it all. Small, worn, scratched, as if it had been carried around for years. I didn't even think about it, just pressed play, thinking maybe his work notes or to-do list. But instead it was my voice. Mine, angry, yelling about the broken coffee mug last week. And then his whisper, so calm, so smug, it made my blood run cold. She's gone off the rails again, this is too much. I froze. My hands clenched the thing so tight my fingers turned white. My stomach twisted as if someone had kicked me in the gut. Is this for real? My husband, with whom I've been sleeping under the same blanket, eating at the same table, building a life for the past 5 years, is secretly recording me like I'm a psycho from some documentary? I pressed play. Again, not believing my ears. My voice again, harsh, on edge. It was Tuesday when he forgot about our anniversary dinner. I'd snapped then, screamed, thrown that stupid mug in the sink 5 years together, and he hadn't even said sorry. And there's his voice in the background. Her tantrums are proof, getting worse and worse. Tantrums? Proof of what? I'm 32. I'm a reasonably successful interior designer, earning more than he and his perpetually promising startup, which is in its 3rd year of minus. I sat there staring at the damn recorder, feeling everything boiling inside. Shock, anger, fear, all mixed into one hot lump. 5 years I thought we were a team. 5 years I'd turned a blind eye to his excuses, to his coldness, to the way he waved me off when I asked where he'd been before midnight. Turns out he was collecting evidence. But for what? I rewound the tape backwards, listening to every word. There was more, scraps of phrases, where he mumbles about instability, and everyone sees it. See what? See who? I remembered how he'd been acting strangely the last few months. About 6 months ago he started pulling away, less talking, more work. Evasive answers. I remember one time he accidentally spilled coffee on my sketch for a client, and I was yelling because the deadline was a day away. He stood there looking at me with that stupid grin of his, and then he said, you need to rest, you're too worked up. I thought he was just pissing me off with his calmness, and now I realize he was faking it. Wanted me to explode. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to play the tape again. There was a moment where I was muttering something about him coming home late, and he was whispering, "She's losing control, this is no joke." Losing control? I was pulling 2 of us while he was playing big boss. I turned off the recorder when I heard the water in the shower subside, and could already hear his footsteps. I should have kept my cool. He walked in, wet hair towel on his hips, grinning ear to ear as if nothing had happened. "You okay, Em?" he asks, like he cares. I nodded, shoving the recorder under my pillow. My voice almost trailed off, but I squeezed it out. "Yeah, it's fine." Okay, fuck him. I was definitely not fine. My brain was spinning like crazy, going over everything over the years. How he'd looked down at me when I complained about being tired. How he waved me off when I asked him to help with something around the house. How he'd say, "You're too emotional," every time I tried to get through to him. And now this. The tape. Evidence. My own husband was compiling a dossier on me like I was a criminal. But why? To leave me? To make me look crazy and take this house? I put everything into it. Every line, every piece of furniture, every damn lamp. Did he think I was just going to give it to him? I glanced at him as he wiped his hair, babbling some nonsense about the weather. His voice sounded normal, but now I could see the mask behind it. He wasn't just an annoying husband who forgets dates. This was a calculation. A cold, mean calculation. And I sat there, feeling everything turn upside down inside. Shock was replaced by anger, and anger was replaced by something sharp as a blade. I didn't know what he was up to, but one thing was clear. He was playing a game where I was supposed to be the victim. Except he was wrong. I'm not the kind of man to swallow that quietly. If he wants a war, he'll get one. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there listening to him snore, and I thought, how could I have been so blind? All those months he'd been plotting, and I'd just lived my life thinking we were still a team. But now I've seen the truth. That tape recorder wasn't an accident. It's the start of something big, and I have to figure out what it is. Divorce? Money? My reputation? I didn't know. But I did know that he had grossly underestimated me. And that was his biggest mistake. After that night with the tape recorder, I'd been on pins and needles. Every look Kyle gave me, every word he said, seemed like part of some nefarious plan. I couldn't get his whispered words out of my head. She's out of her mind. It was like a broken record in my brain, and I started to notice things I'd never noticed before. He'd been acting strange the last few months, aloof, cold, as if I wasn't his wife but a roommate he tolerated out of politeness. I remember him coming home past midnight, always with these client meetings of his, and when I'd ask where he'd been, he'd wave off. Don't start, you're being dramatic again. At the time, I thought maybe I was overreacting. And now I realize he wasn't just dismissing it. He was setting the stage. I spent the next few days piecing our life together, remembering all the fights that used to seem petty, like that incident a couple months ago when he accidentally erased my work file with a presentation for a client. I was yelling like a crazy person because the deadline was looming, and he was standing there looking at me with that trademark smirk and saying, "You're overreacting, Em, you need to relax." I used to get angry, but then I'd blame myself. Maybe I really was overreacting. Now it hit me. He wasn't just pissing me off. He wanted me to snap, so he'd have a reason to write it down. I decided to dig a little deeper. While he was at his regular meeting, I went through his stuff. I found an old cell phone in his gym bag. He'd said he'd lost it 6 months ago, and there it was lying in his side pocket. Turned it on, batteries still alive, and there was another file. My voice shaking, almost crying. "Kyle, why are you doing this to me? Where have you been?" This was back in April, when he'd come back in the morning 3 nights in a row and I was going crazy with worry. His response to the tapes: "She's losing control, this is no longer a joke." And then a quiet chuckle. "It's all going according to plan." The plan? What fucking plan? I sat on the floor of our bedroom and felt everything crumble inside. This wasn't an accident. This isn't just his annoying behavior. He's putting together a dossier on me like some goddamn detective. But why? To dump me? To make me look crazy and take this house? I put everything into it. Every inch, every detail. The marble countertops, the huge windows, overlooking the garden, the cozy nook with the books. It's my work, my soul. And he'd apparently decided he could just take me out of my own life. My brain was boiling as I tried to figure out how far this had gone. I remembered how he'd started talking about my tiredness more often. You look burned out." He'd throw in with that fake concern of his when I'd come home from work where I was pulling projects for 2. I thought at the time he was just trying to be nice. But now I saw it was a hint. He wanted me to believe that I was going crazy from stress. And those fights, they weren't random either. Like last month when he forgot to pick up my car from the service even though he knew I had an important meeting with a client. I yelled, he didn't say anything, and then he said, "You're too emotional, Em." It's clear now. He was adding fuel to the fire to record my every scream. I got up off the floor, tucking my phone back into my bag, so he wouldn't suspect anything. I had to keep my cool, even though everything inside was churning. Anger was choking me, but I couldn't let it escape, not yet. I had to find out what he was up to, and how deep it went. The divorce? Money? Or something worse? I remembered how he'd brought up the conversation about our house a couple weeks ago. Are you sure we didn't overpay for it?" he asked casually. I joked back then. "It's my dream, Kyle, I know what I'm doing." He nodded, but something strange flashed in his eyes. I realized now that he wasn't just asking. He was figuring out how to take it for himself. When he got home, I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee and pretending it was business as usual. He walked in, dropped his bag, smiled his stupid smile. "It's been a rough day, Em. How are you doing?" I nodded, squeezed out. Fine. Fine." I could barely keep from throwing that coffee in his face. He was talking about some bullshit from work, and I looked at him and saw a stranger. A man who'd pretended to be my partner for 5 years. And now he was digging me a hole. His voice sounded normal, but now I could hear the lie behind it. Every word was part of the mask he wore so I wouldn't suspect a thing. I sat there, holding the mug so tight my fingers were aching, and thought, how could I have been so blind? All these months he'd been weaving his web, and I'd just been living, working, building our house, thinking we were together. But now I saw the truth. This tape recorder. This phone, they're not random finds. They're pieces of his plan, and I had to figure out which. 1. To make me look crazy in front of my friends? To take away everything I've created? Or to break me completely? I didn't know. But what I did know was that he'd miscalculated if he thought I'd just give up. That night I lay next to him, listening to his snoring, and felt the anger turn into something cold and sharp. I lay awake, going over his every move, every phrase in my head. He thought I was weak, that I would break under his game. But he was wrong. This house is mine. This life is mine. And I'm not giving them up without a fight. I didn't know what to do with those notes yet, but one thing was clear. He'd started the war, and I was going to finish it. And he had no idea how far I was willing to go. After the discovery with the phone, I started to notice Kyle tightening the screws. He wasn't just waiting for my breakdowns anymore. He was making them happen. It had been a week since the night I found his notes, and he decided to up the ante. On Saturday, he called our friend Sarah over for dinner. Sarah is my Sarah, the one I drank wine with until the wee hours of the morning, laughed at his dumb jokes, shared everything. I always thought she was on my side, but that night she was different. Smiling too strained, glancing at Kyle like they were sharing a secret. I knew right away something was wrong. He started his show with little things. He said he forgot to buy groceries for dinner, even though he knew I'd been up all day with clients. I gritted my teeth, remained silent. But he didn't stop. An hour later, while I was cooking, he accidentally pushed my laptop off the table. The screen cracked and I snapped. I yelled, "Are you a complete idiot?" My voice was shaking. I hated myself for it, but my nerves were on edge. Sarah sighed, shaking her head. You really have been a little jumpy lately." And Kyle? He just stood there looking at me, with that smile of his, cold, calculating, like everything was going according to plan. Later, as I was clearing my desk, I noticed a microphone wrapper in the trash. Small, almost unnoticeable, but I knew what it meant. He'd recorded me. Again. My heart raced like a madman, but I didn't let it show. I sat back down, poured myself some wine, took a sip to keep from screaming right there. He and Sarah were talking about nothing, and I looked at them and realized that this wasn't just a fight. This isn't just a divorce. He's building a whole story where I'm the crazy one, and he's the victim. And Sarah's helping him. I started to wonder what he wanted. Money? Freedom? No, it's more than that. I remembered him talking about our house a couple days ago. Are you sure we should be spending this much on upkeep?" he asked casually. I brushed it off. "It's our house. Kyle, it's worth it." He nodded then, but I could see it now. He wasn't just babbling. He wanted to take it. Everything I'd put into our life, he planned to appropriate by making me look like a crazy person who couldn't handle it. And Sarah? She was his safety net, his witness. All evening I kept my face even though I was shaking inside. He and Sarah laughed, drank wine, and I sat there like a cage, feeling the walls clench. After dinner, I went to the bathroom, closed the door, and just stood there looking at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to breathe. That was the moment I realized he wouldn't stop. He would push until I broke, or until everyone believed his fairy tale. I remembered how he'd been setting up scenes over the past few months. How he accidentally left my wallet in the car when I was on my way to a meeting and I was late, snapping at him on the phone. How he forgot to hand me an important call from a client. And I looked unprofessional. Every time he'd say, "You're overreacting." And I foolishly blamed myself. Now I see it was his plan. He wanted me to look unstable. To make friends, clients maybe. Even a judge believe I was unstable. And Sarah was damn sure in on it. I remembered her calling me a couple weeks ago, just to chat, and asking how I was doing at work. At the time, I thought she was worried. Now I realized she was snooping around, gathering gossip. For his story, my best friend had sold out to him, and the thought almost made me sick. When I got back, they were still sitting at the table. Kyle was telling some story about work, and Sarah was chiming in, giggling. I looked at them and felt like a knife had been stuck in my back. 5 years of marriage, years of friendship, and here I was, sitting like a stranger, surrounded by traitors. But I didn't let it show. I smiled, I poured some wine, I said, "It's nice that you're having so much fun." Kyle nodded, satisfied, thinking I hadn't noticed. And I looked at him and thought, do you really think I'm that stupid? That night I lay in bed listening to him snore, and tried to get my thoughts together. He wasn't just recording me. He was directing a whole play with me as the main villain. And Sarah is his supporting actress. I remember him once saying, you should get some rest. You look on edge. I joked back then, but now I realized he wanted me to believe that. Nonsense. He wanted me to give in, but I wasn't going to. The anger inside me burned so brightly I almost didn't feel afraid. He thought he had me cornered, but he was wrong. The next day, I started to look at him more closely, noticing how he checks his phone with quick glances, how he puts it away when I walk in, how he says don't sweat it with that smirk of his every time I ask questions. I didn't know how far he'd gone, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a divorce. He wanted to break me, take everything I had, and get away with it. And Sarah was his trump card. The thought made me shake, but I kept my cool. I had to figure out how he was going to pull this off, and what else he had up his sleeve. Before I went to bed, I sat at my desk, pretending to work while I watched him. He was flipping through his phone, smiling, as if he had everything under control. And I realized he thought he'd won, that I'd break like he wanted me to. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't who I used to be. I wasn't going to be his victim. If he wanted to play, I'd play better. And he had no idea what I could do when I was backed into a corner. This was a war, and I was going to win it. In the morning, I walked up to him with red eyes like I hadn't slept half the night. My voice was shaking as I said, "You're right, Kyle, I'm really not like this lately." He froze, looking at me with that smirk of his, but something like victory flashed in his eyes. "I told you, you need to rest," he replied almost affectionately. And I stood there nodding, thinking, come on, take the bait, you creep. My phone was in my pocket, and the recording was already in progress. I sobbed. I let out a sob. I don't know what's wrong with me, maybe I am going crazy. He took the bait. Completely. I've been seeing this for a long time. He started, and his voice became so smug I wanted to punch him right there. "You take on too much, everyone notices how you snap." I nodded, hiding my eyes so he wouldn't see how sick his words made me feel. He continued, "I had to record a couple times to show you what it looks like from the outside. You realize it's for your own good." "For my good? Really?" I almost laughed, but I kept my mask on. It was gold, his confession, word for word on my phone. I moved on. Called Sarah, told her I needed advice. She came in an hour later, all caring, with that fake smile of hers. I sat there, rubbing the edge of my sleeve, mumbling, "I feel like I'm losing control, maybe Kyle's right." She piped up, "He's worried about you, we can all see how hard this is for you." I almost choked on her lie, but nodded, squeezing out a tear. My phone was on the table, disguised as a stack of papers, quietly recording her every word. She added, "He just wants to help, you know that." "Help? Why, he's in cahoots with her to drown me." But I smiled, saying, "Thank you, Sarah, you're a true friend." On the inside I was seething, but on the outside I was the sissy they wanted me to be. As Sarah drank her tea, I noticed her interjecting with Kyle as he walked in. They thought I couldn't see them, but I noticed everything. Every gesture, every look. They were sure I was hooked. So I gave them that feeling, let them relax. That evening I made another spectacle of myself. Kyle forgot to warn me about a meeting with his co-workers, so I snapped, threw a pillow across the room, yelled, "Can you even think about me for once?" He stood there, staring as if he was waiting for it, and I knew he was taking notes. I saw him hide his hand in his pocket where his phone was. Great. Let him think he was winning. Afterward, I locked myself in the bathroom, turned on the water so he couldn't hear, and listened to my recordings. His voice, "You're losing it, everyone notices. Sarah, he's worried about you." It was like a knife in the back, but I smiled. I had something that could destroy them. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed more to squash his plan. I remembered how he'd left his laptop open a couple days ago. I hadn't paid attention then, but now I decided to check it out. I waited until he was asleep and went into his files. There were folders, lab rat, records, evidence, ___. My heart raced when I opened one. Audio, videos, even notes, dates, times, descriptions of my tantrums. The bastard kept a diary like I was a. And then I found something else. An email to his lawyer. "It's unstable, there's evidence. Need to make sure I keep the house." It took my breath away. The house. My house. He Didn't just want to leave, he wanted to take everything I'd built and leave me with nothing. I sat staring at the screen and felt the anger turn to an icy calm. He thought I would break, that his notes would make me weak. But he was wrong. I downloaded everything, the letters, the notes, the files. It was my trump card, and I was going to use it. The next day, I decided to up the ante. I told Kyle I wanted to talk to my friends, apologize for my behavior. He brightened up. That's right, Em, they'll realize you need help. Help. I was going to show everyone what a jerk he was. I set up a night, invited Sarah, a couple of our mutual friends. I told Kyle I was admitting my mistakes. He was over the moon, thinking I was giving up. And I sat there planning every move. My notes, his files, evidence. Everything was ready. I risked everything, but I didn't care. He wanted to break me? Let him try. All day I kept my face. Cooked dinner, smiled at him like I didn't know anything. He'd talk about work, make jokes, and I'd nod, hiding the storm inside. He thought I was on my knees, that his plan had worked. And I gave him that feeling, let him think he'd won. But inside I was ready. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to destroy his game. He'd been setting me up for months, collecting his evidence, but now I had a weapon. And I was going to strike in a way he'd never recover from. When he went to bed, I sat at my desk staring at my phone. My notes lay there like a ticking time bomb. I knew that tomorrow everything would change. Either I would outplay him or he would finish me. But I wasn't going to lose. He'd underestimated me from the start, and that was his mistake. I turned off the light, lay next to him, listening to him snore, and thought, you have no idea what's in store for you. Tomorrow I'll show you who's crazy. The day of reckoning had arrived. I scheduled Friday night, called Sarah, Kyle, and a couple of our mutual friends, those who hadn't yet chosen a side in this war. Said I wanted to apologize for my behavior. Kyle was delighted, walking around all day with that smug grin of his, thinking I'd finally snapped. That's right, Em, it's time to admit your mistakes. He tossed in the morning, clapping me on the shoulder like I was his doggy. I nodded and smiled, but inside I was seething. Let him think he'd won. Let him relax. My plan was ready, and I was going to blow his world to smithereens. By evening, everyone was gathered. I set the table. Wine, appetizers, nothing fancy, but enough to create a cozy atmosphere. Kyle sat at the head like a king, Sarah next to him, all thoughtful, and my friends chatted, unaware of what awaited them. I stood up and raised my glass, my voice shaking a little, on purpose, for effect. Guys, I want to say a few words. I began, looking at Kyle. He nodded, satisfied, as if he was waiting for my repentance. I haven't been on my best behavior lately, and I'm sorry. Sarah pressed her lips together. Kyle leaned back, both of them thinking I was giving up. And I just stalled, enjoying their reassurance. Then I set my glass down and said, but you know, I found something here, and I want to share. Kyle frowned, but didn't have time to react. I turned on the Bluetooth speaker and his voice filled the room. She's losing control, this is no longer a joke. He sounded from the recording I found on his phone. Silence. My friends froze, Sarah went pale, and Kyle jerked toward the speaker. What the hell? But I was faster. Pressed play on the next file, my own. I recorded it to show her snapping, it's for her own good. His words clear, smug. I tossed the microphone wrapper on the table. Explain this, I said, looking him in the eye. The room exploded with whispers. One of my friends, Mike, asked, Kyle, is that for real? And he jumped up, face red. It's a montage. She's lying. I grinned, turned on the projector. His letters to his lawyer flashed on the wall. She's unstable, there's proof. I should keep the house. It was all there, the dates, the notes, his plan to take everything, making me look crazy. Sarah jumped up, muttered something about, I need to get out, and ran out. Kyle yelled. You don't understand, she drove herself crazy. But no one was listening. I stood there, arms crossed, watching his world fall apart. Mike shook his head. Dude, that's low. Another friend, Liz, turned to me. Why didn't you say anything? I shrugged. I wanted him to bury himself. Kyle grabbed his phone, trying to dial something, but I dropped it. Too late. I already talked to a lawyer. The house is mine, I have the proof, and your debts are your problem. His face twisted, he took a step toward me. You wouldn't dare. But I didn't flinch. Look at me, Kyle. I already dared you. He flew out the door, slamming it so hard the glass shook. My friends stayed behind, some pouring me wine, some clapping me on the shoulder. You did good, you hung in there. Till the end. I sat, drinking, listening to them, but it was quiet inside. Victory. Pure cold mine. Sarah then wrote me a long message saying she didn't want to. Kyle made her. I deleted it without reading it. She and he deserved each other, and I deserved my freedom. A couple days later, I found out that Kyle had tried to call my lawyer to threaten me, but he'd failed. My evidence was ironclad: notes, letters, even this microphone wrapper. I kept the house. His startup I'd been pulling for years collapsed without my money. He moved back in with his mom, leaving debts and empty promises. And I was left alone but not broken. That night I sat with a glass of wine, staring out the window. The silence was deafening, but, for the first time in years, peaceful. I remembered how he'd looked down on me, how he'd set up fights, how he'd thought I was weak. And I smiled. He wanted to make me look crazy, and I made him look like an idiot. All his notes, his plans, his lies backfired on him. I outplayed him at his own game, and it was the best feeling in the world. My friends would say, you're like from a movie, how did you pull that off? And I just shrugged. He gave me the gun, I just pulled the trigger. Kyle thought I was going to fall to my knees, but instead I got up and hit him so he didn't get up. And you know what? I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. He deserved it. Every second of his humiliation was payment for the months he'd tried to wipe me out. I'm alone now. My house is mine, my life is mine, and no one else will tell me I'm too emotional. I sat and drank wine and thought, this is the end of his game, but the beginning of my freedom. He wanted to break me, but I became stronger. And if he ever tries to come back, and I know he's so stubborn he can, I'll be ready. Because now I know what I'm capable of. This is my story, guys. I took his plan and smeared it on the wall. And damn, it's so cool to be the one who wins.